We're going to move towards style and aestheticism now with a panel entitled The Leading Edge of Sustainable Fashion, featuring three of the key characters in transitioning the fashion industry to a more sustainable one. So I'm going to introduce Patrick McDowell, who arguably is the top sustainable designer of his generation, showing at London Fashion Week. Dominic Jones, who is a famous and edgy fine jewelry designer who latterly has become the creative director of what is probably the world's most sustainable fine jewelry brand called 886 by the Royal Mint. And then finally, Sara Grady, who is the co-founder of British Pasture Leather. Alice, where are you? Her co-founder is also here and actually just published a book on the subject that we're going to speak about. The two of them have founded a business which seeks to become the #1 sourcing platform for leather which is sustainably sourced. And what that means, we're going to dig into. I'm basically going to conduct this panel discussion in a sequence of allowing each of them to give us an exposition of their businesses and how their business models are innovative, how they've innovated their business models to become as sustainable as possible. So I'm going to begin with Patrick. So Patrick, you have been ballyhooed by Anna Wintour, for example, as one of the most important designers to watch because you have really truly internalized this ethos of sustainability. How does that translate? Because especially in the apparel and fashion industry, greenwashing is rife, from fast fashion to haute couture. So what does that mean for you? I mean, and start the story wherever you wish.
Mm-hmm. I first started as a 13-year-old. I made a school bag out of a pair of jeans and was really fascinated by how I could create something out of nothing. And then that story kind of continued throughout my teens. I would make things out of unexpected materials, one being my childhood bedroom curtains, which my mum was thrilled about, and then went on to Sandra St. Martin's and continued to do it, and then eventually graduated from there with a collection created from old materials from Burberry and Swarovski, and launched at a time when sustainability was considered to be kind of like the Hessian sack narrative, and my stuff didn't look like that, and I think that was kind of what started this quite press-led baptism of fire into the fashion industry, which kind of began Patrick McDowell as a brand.
So you garnered attention because your clothes were very stylish, beautiful, and glamorous, instead of kind of a homespun and done cloth, basically. Now, I think for a lot of people in the room, they're not actually aware of the conventional fashion industry model that would be pursued by a recent graduate of a school like St. Martin's. What is the typical process of making and then selling fashion? And then so we can contrast it to what you're doing.
Yes.
Tell us about how fashion is usually made in a nutshell.
Yeah, so traditionally you would start by showing a collection, maybe at Fashion Week, and then you would hope that that collection was then bought by buyers from a wholesaler. So that might be Selfridges or Harrods or another multi-brand department store.
Where would you source your fabric?
You would source your fabric from wherever sold. In a luxury space, you'd buy material that kind of looks, but also costs the best, and you might buy.
It would be new.
It would be new.
Yes, that's what I'm. Yeah.
Yes, and it probably might include a synthetic, and then you would, hope to sell that to buyers. They would buy from you at a price that is competitive in the market, which means you're not making that much of a return. And then traditionally 6 months later, they would pay you for that product which you've had to put out for and make, and then deliver to the store. And the main kind of issue there is that the main markup is being taken by the store because that's timesing the product by 3 from what you're selling it to them for. But also we're guessing what people want, right? So it's a whole store full of stock that buyers have bought in the hope that people will buy it and wear it. But ultimately what happens is that a lot of that stock isn't bought and is never worn. And that's one of the reasons why we have a huge overproduction problem in the fashion industry at all levels. So from fast fashion all the way up to luxury.
Okay, so it's a penalizing business model that's difficult to shoulder for any designer financially. And then we end up with lots of unsold inventory, which, do you know what happens sometimes with that unsold stock?
Yeah, so sometimes that stock is burnt, sometimes it's destroyed. Some legislation now prevents brands from burning in their country, so it's sometimes burnt elsewhere, which means it's then shipped, sometimes by plane, to that place to be burnt. Or if it can't be burnt, it's actually destroyed by hand or by machine. Or occasionally it's kind of like debranded and then sold much cheaper somewhere else. Or in some cases it's just held in warehouses because they don't know what to do with it.
Okay. Now, how is your business model different?
The main difference is that we only make what people actually order, and so everything that we produce is made to order and limited edition. So in the same way that you might have a piece of art and it comes in an edition of, say, 20, we do the same thing with our pieces. And so we sit in a luxury space, and our offering is luxury fashion. So we're traditional in the sense that we still show at Fashion Week because we found that to be the best way for our brand to grow in terms of a marketing exercise. But in terms of the pieces themselves, it's a model that actually I've taken from when my grandma was younger. She was born in 23 and was, at that time used to order clothes. Clothes were made for people. And the best thing about that is that we get to make things that suit people and fit them properly. And we also get to have an amazing connection with the people that actually own our pieces, which is what you lose in that wholesale model because there's a middleman, and so you don't have the connection with your consumer. We still have that, which means that we can then offer things like aftercare and redesign. And maybe you've bought an amazing dress from us, and 10 years later you might decide you'd like us to remake that for your daughter, and that's something we can do because we've kept in touch with you because we sold it directly to you rather than through a store.
Now, don't kill me for asking you this unprepared question. What is the average price of one of your orders or a piece, because they're all basically bespoke?
Yeah, so, our prices kind of start from at £1,000 and then they go up from there. And so I'm very aware that that's not accessible to everybody. But like I said, we position ourselves in a luxury space in the UK fashion industry, and so our products reflect that. But I personally then do quite a lot of work across the industry to help move the needle around sustainability.
Now, aren't you worried that now you're content with this small is beautiful model, but I mean, for sure, that could relegate you to niche status, and in an era of globalized, famous brand names, I mean, do you feel that that is satisficing, or how do you actually make a living? How do you flourish? How do you make your brand flourish?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think you can actually build quite a compelling business model around made-to-order and limited edition, and we've proved that through our projections. And so that's wonderful. And although the scale of units is small with what we do, the exposure can be really high through platforms like London Fashion Week and through the fact that we create really special pieces. And because we're not in this kind of rat race wholesale business model, we're able to create much more of a spectacle around our shows because I simply have more time to think creatively in that way. But then, another part of the business is these collaborations with global brands like Burberry or Swarovski or Pinko, which is a brand I now have a position at, an Italian brand.
How big is that brand?
So that brand turns over around 250 to 300 million euros a year and has around 200 of their own stores around the world. And so, with them, the impact we're able to make there is much bigger. And we found through these collaborations with global companies, we're able to really, change the needle in a bigger way. And so it's really incredible for me to be able to have that impact in those bigger businesses, but then also do these incredibly creative and wonderful pieces with my own brand. And so
that business subsidizes your runway business. And how is this latest collection sustainable? Is it dead stock textile? Are you using innovative circular fibers, or what are these made out of?
Yeah, so these pieces above, I think, are a mixture of some materials from Pinko's archive, so from past collections that were bought and then not used for those collections, some certified organic, some certified viscose, and then also made close to where Pinko's headquarters are, so they're designed, sourced, and made as close to the headquarters as possible in Italy. And that's a really important part of this conversation to getting the CO2 emissions of the garments down, because often clothes are flown all over the world before they're finished. And another great thing is that we know through employability laws and things in Italy that the people making them are being paid in a certain way, and through working with certified factories, you can assure that as well, which is great.
Okay. So now moving on to Dominic. Tell us about, Dominic has a long history as a very well-known designer deploying traditional techniques. What is 886 Royal Mint? And tell us a little bit about that, and also tell us about how it's really, really innovative.
Sure. 886 by the Royal Mint is a new project from the Royal Mint. It's a fine jewellery brand. It's a fine jewellery brand that we launched last year. The year before last. Just realised we're in a year. And yeah, it's a completely new venture for the Royal Mint, which is obviously most famous for its currency. It's been the producer of coinage for 1,100 years, and they set out to start diversifying their business to secure jobs and skilled labour for their workforce. And one of the projects that they looked at and landed on was to launch a fine jewellery company. They reached out to me, and we created the concept for 886 and then launched it. So some of the things that make it sustainable, and why I'm here, I guess, is that all of the gold that we use alongside launching the jewellery brand, they also launched a recycling and reclamation project working with a chemistry called Exia, which extracts gold from electronic consumer waste. And it's the first time it's been able to be done at an ambient temperature. And they've kind of backed from the theoretical chemistry of these two chemists in Canada, and have kind of built it all the way through into small batch labs, and now they're building a huge lab plant at the Royal Mint. So all of the gold that we use in our jewellery comes from discarded and broken electronics from the circuit boards. And all of the silver that we use comes from refined old medical x-rays. So we worked to extract the silver nitrate from old x-rays from the medical industry, NHS, private medical, veterinary, that were being stored and unused, and extracted back out of it the silver. Alongside that, there's other things like the fact that we've been investing in sustainable energies. We launched the second wind turbine at the Mint last year, and we have a solar field. So it's not enough energy to make the whole of the Royal Mint sustainable, but it is enough to say that our jewellery is being run from sustainable energy as well.
Okay. I actually came across 886 Royal Mint because my husband bought me one of their bracelets, and then I realized that Dominic's colleague was an old friend, and got into this discussion, which is crazy. Learned it was probably the world's most sustainable fine jewelry company, and therefore I'm pointing to this cuff because I did a really crude estimate, and it probably takes between 500 to 600 motherboards to extract the precious metal for a gold version of that one. But what my question was going to be, what happens with all of the rest of the motherboard? Because that's also its own kind of electronic waste, which can be toxic.
Sure. So with the plant, they have found usages for every single element of the electronic consumer waste. We, as the jewellery brand, only use the gold, but they extract all of the base metals. They break every single part down. Everything from the gases that are being produced to the silica, they have refined out each individual part of it, and they're working with suppliers to find usages for that. Okay, that's a pretty revolutionary model. Yeah, there's some. What are the byproducts from the? There's also copper. There is I don't remember. There was a whole bunch of other materials inside motherboards, but. Now, I want to go on to the design and how it also has an ethos of sustainability and culture embedded in each piece. Can you also tell us about how the coin-making techniques have been transposed to the context of fine jewelry to make the jewelry more sustainable, broadly speaking? Sure. So, one of the things that is unique to the Mint in terms of making jewellery is the fact that they use striking instead of casting. So at cold temperature, under high tonnage, they're squashed into the form, whereas like most jewellery is made through casting, which is you heat the metal into a molten form, pour it into a mould, centrifugal, and then let it cool down. But with this, it's done under high pressure, which means that it's like a third stronger as well. So it's sustainable in the sense that all of the jewellery that we're trying to create is been designed to outlive you. You know, I'm creating pieces that are like future heirlooms that will last for multiple generations, that they're designed with a sensibility that they're not disposable and will be loved and passed on, you know.
We should have shown some of Dominic's jewelry from before, because it is very edgy, and it's collected by celebrities including, by Karl Lagerfeld, Beyonce, David Bowie, Rihanna, Harry Styles, Snoop Dogg. The list goes on and on and on. These are very conservative for Dominic. Did you find it hard to follow this brief?
Not really. I really enjoyed it. I mean, most of a lot of those people that you mentioned were from my brand, which I did in my 20s, which was in a similar churn to what Patrick described as for traditional fashion. And I stepped away from that because it wasn't a sustainable way of being a creative, and I didn't fit into that despite being successful in it. So no, I as I've grown up, I really enjoy generally designing to a brief. I think it's something really beautiful, interpreting the needs and wants of something and kind of being of service through design. I see my old work as like just like being a musician and only playing the drums, but now I get to play like flutes and different other things because it's not just what is in me, you know, I'm interpreting it through different vessels.
Well, that's a beautiful message. Now, I'm going to move on to the question of certification and supply chain and transparency with Sara. Well, I'm going to come back to you and ask you about certification later. But Sara, okay, tell us about your company. What led you to found it with Alice? I mean, why get into this whole thorny mess of leather and cows?
So British Pasture leather is the first supply of leather that is traceable to regenerative farms in the UK, made entirely in Britain. And Alice and I both came to this project because we had each independently noticed a disconnection between leather material and agriculture, which I think puzzled each of us because one would think that we would tend to associate leather with cattle and agriculture, but in fact that is very rarely the case, particularly throughout the leather supply chain. So I arrived at this work through my most recent background working on projects related to the development of regional and sustainable food systems. And in the course of that work, I had received an education about the role of grazing animals in stewarding pasture landscapes. I was working in the Hudson Valley region, just north of New York City. And that prompted me to go from being a longtime vegetarian to becoming an omnivore, with a very strong ethos around using all parts of the animal, which I was able to do much more easily from a culinary perspective. But when it came to questioning the destiny of the hides of cattle that were being raised on farms that prioritize animal welfare and ecosystem function, it was very difficult to get an answer as to what happens to the hide, which I considered to be a very valuable part of that production. And then Alice came to this question through her training as a fashion designer, working with leather as a material and wanting similarly to query the origins of that material and finding it impossible to get an answer as to what the agricultural origin of leather as a material might be.
Okay, so I think that no one in the room actually, who knows how, like, what the leather supply chain of their shoes or handbags looks like.
And why would you? I mean, we didn't know.
I think it's one of the most, we remain willfully ignorant of it, you could even say. There's some kind of weird sociological disconnect there.
Yeah.
Tell us about that, because when I found out from you, it felt pretty disturbing.
Okay, so at a very high level, what happens is, so most leather comes from cattle that are being raised for meat, so beef cattle. And what happens is animals are taken to the slaughterhouse and slaughtered for meat, obviously for food, and the 4 quarters of that carcass become the meat that enters the food supply chain. What is known as the 5th quarter, which is everything beyond the 4 quarters of that meat carcass, which includes organs, blood, fat, bones, and the hide, is then sold by the slaughterhouse into the various supply chains that process those materials, those products for other purposes, be it pet foods, nutritional supplements, or in this case, leather material. And so there are aggregators of those products, and so when talking about leather, there are traders that focus on collecting cattle hides, which have to be salted and preserved after being removed from the carcass in order to store them until which time they can be delivered to a tannery. So the hide trade is a highly globalized trade, which means that most leather that we interact with in our daily lives has traveled very long distances, sometimes around the globe, even a couple of times. And there is no distinction, currently there's no distinction made around the origin of that raw material. I know we'll talk more about traceability. Increasingly, there's traceability to place of origin, but there's no distinction around the agricultural practices in which those animals were raised. So anyway, so then you have large volumes of hides, which are considered to be a cheap commodity, so individually have very low value, which means that industry depends on large economies of scale, which then means that it's very strongly attached to industrialized agriculture and factory farming. And then those hides go through many stages of processing to become leather, tanning and finishing. Often those stages happen in very different places, so it can be moved again multiple times during that processing stage. And then into finished leather, which is a highly manipulated material, actually. We think of it as a natural material, but it's often been, its natural character has often been erased, and other methods of processing that standardize that as a uniform material, including the addition of polyurethanes. And then that material goes to factories and manufacturers of leather goods.
Where does most of the processing of leather take place? And do you know any numbers on how much leather is from the UK, or what is the biggest market for the biggest country supplying leather to the global market? Do you have any
the biggest country, I don't know if it's China or India, actually, but it's definitely not here. So the UK at one time would have had a very strong leather processing trade and infrastructure, and that sadly has mostly disappeared, again, because of globalization. So it is not the UK. And one thing I did want to mention, though, actually, and I don't know if we'll get into this, is that the majority of leather around the world is tanned using a heavy metal, which is chrome. So chrome tanning is the dominant method of processing hides into leather. That's not the method that we're using currently for our production. But in any case, those factories are in many countries of the world, but very few of them are here.
Okay. Now tell us what you're doing for your own business to make your own supply chain as sustainable as possible.
Okay. So we set out to see if it would be possible for us to produce finished leather material that could then be marketed to brands and designers. So we're not currently making product with the leather material, but we set out to see if we could produce a quality leather material entirely in the UK using the hides of cattle raised, as I said, on regenerative farms. So we have begun that process by aligning ourselves with a certification called Pasture for Life, which is a farming association in the UK that certifies farms with the highest standards of animal welfare and ecological agriculture.
But usually with the view that's for meat. For meat, not for leather, but that's the only organization that you can work with.
That certification, yes, was founded to certify meat and dairy.
Yeah.
And effectively, it's certifying meat and dairy from 100% pasture operations. That's the overarching principle. So we have identified farms with that certification, and then what we have to do is identify the abattoir that serves those farms. So we have to coordinate the collection of hides from the point of the abattoir.
Wow.
And so that becomes a really important fact in talking about the leather supply chain, because there's a misimpression that people have, which is that farms sell the hides of their cattle, and that is not the case. It's the slaughterhouse that sells the hides. So we have to work with the slaughterhouse to set aside the hides from the farms that we've chosen as our source farms, and then we work with the hide collector that serves that abattoir to continue that segregation for those hides, to collect and salt and store those hides for us until we have enough to take to the tannery. And the tannery that we're currently working with, which is located in Bristol, uses a traditional method of leather tanning, which is called vegetable tanning, but has nothing to do with vegetables. It uses natural tannins from barks and leaves. And we have to meet their minimum number in order to contract with them for that service. We're very fortunate to be able to work with them. They are one of the few remaining tanneries in the UK, and the only tannery that we could contract with for this method of leather production. Those hides spend about 3.5 months in the tannery, at which point they are unfinished leather, which we then relocate to a finishing facility in Northampton, where we've been collaborating with the finishers to produce a range of finished qualities and styles, again, that honors the natural character of that material.
Let me guess that when you had the idea for the business, you had no idea what the labyrinthine nightmare it was going to be, basically.
We had an inkling, but no, I think it's one of those things. Had we known, what would we have done differently?
No, this led me to actually suggest to Sara that after all the legwork you've done, because this is such an inchoate business idea, that maybe you should go into the certification business. And on that note, I want to ask the three of them, because again, I always like to keep it very consumer facing. It's quite a minefield out there, especially in fashion, I would say, because where there's the most claims of sustainability. So tell us a little bit about the landscape of certification regimes, and I mean, can a consumer distinguish? Is there anything that is actually a uniform, systematic standard that's been accepted? What's the state of play on that? Or are you waiting for the EU, or what's happening?
Yeah, first of all, clothes are very complicated because there's so many elements of the fashion supply chain, right? So it's sometimes different to jewelry, for example, where maybe there's a few ingredients. Sometimes in clothes it can be more than 10 fibers, and they might have been finished in like more than 50 different places. And so that's very difficult to track. Usually, at the moment, you have certifications for the main material that a garment is made from, and that's usually the material that's listed on the label. They're not always globally recognized, and sometimes the certifications themselves can be quite difficult to get unless you're kind of like a global business.
Well, which are the main ones that you
like certified organic, right? So organic is something we're used to in food, and you can also have organic certified in clothes. The Forest Alliance you can have for material that comes from trees. And then there's also various different certifications around recycled standards, which you can get for polyester materials or nylon.
Okay, so basically the certification applies only to the fiber rather than the system in place at the brand making the clothes. It's only one narrow element of it.
Yes, usually, and for the certification to be valid at the point of sale, the different stakeholders in the supply chain before that have to buy the certification. So, for example, with Pinko has to own the certification to be able to tell you that they've bought organic cotton from an organic cotton certified seller of cotton, which also has to have bought from an organic certified grower. And if the final brand doesn't have the certification, they can't actually tell you that what they're selling you is organic, even if it is. And so it's a bit of a minefield, and it's perhaps not the best way to organize it, but to organize it properly is kind of like the job of legislation, I think.
Is there any legislation afoot which is going to assist with this?
There's some starting in like New York specifically had a bit more of movement on this. The EU has something going through at the moment called the EU Green Claims Initiative, which is aiming to stop brands from claiming things that aren't real. So that's more on like the greenwashing side of things. Of course, we're not now under that remit, unfortunately. And so to answer your question, not really.
Okay. Dominic? Okay, it continues to be a minefield also just because of the sheer number of players in the field and phases in the supply chain. Gold and precious metal and jewelry should be easier, I would think. Okay, no, he's nodding in a
I wouldn't say so
bad
necessarily.
way.
I think it's just as much of a minefield in a literal sense. So like, I mean, you would think things like recycled. I think when lots of people are kind of saying recycled metals, and there's most big brands these days in jewelry say that they recycle, but that kind of conjures up the idea of like pawn shops collecting up old jewelry that's broken beyond use and melting it down. But the classifications right now are that it needs to be melted from one structure to another to have a different use and that's basically what happens anyway with grain silver into casting, which is why there's such huge volumes of people saying that they're using recycled metals and recycled silver, because the way you make jewelry classifies as recycling the metal. Which I think
I mean, just make, like, let's say I melted a bullion bar to make into a bracelet, that would count as recycling.
Yeah, technically. Yeah.
Okay, that sounds terrible.
yeah, which means that like bad mining can be kind of greenwashed in ways. I think that is. They are planning to be changing those classifications and becoming a lot more tight in it, but that's what it is currently. And yeah, with mining, it's like it's really hard to keep really illegal mined gold. There's huge problems with what's happening in the Amazon right now, being illegally mined for gold, and the huge impact that's having on biodiversity and the chemicals that they're using and the way that they're doing that.
But there are certifications.
There are.
What are those?
There's Fairmined, there's SMO. SMO is probably the best.
That means single mine origin.
Yes.
What do those mean?
Single mine origin is probably the best in the industry. They're trying to really tackle that, which is where they can trace from one source, one mine, all the way through to the product, which currently, you just don't have. You have no idea what elements and what amount of gold goes into it. But even with from an environmental point, even when you look at them, and they are the best in practice, and I'm not shitting on them at all. Like, I think what they're doing is totally valid. You still look at it, and it's a huge, vast mine with huge, big machineries. And it just doesn't equate to, say, for example, what we're doing, which is using a material that would have 99% of electronic consumer waste in the UK is shipped to the other side of the world, burnt and buried in landfill. You know, what the gold that we're using is beyond recycled. You know, it's completely being saved and reused in a way that it just wouldn't be. You know?
Do you guys ever worry that you're going to deplete the entire stock of PCB board?
No.
Precious metal?
We're currently making something like 50 million tons per year of electronic consumer waste.
Okay. So we don't have any concern about that. Sarah, what about it's obviously very inchoate, these developments in leather. It sounds like it's really late to the party in sustainability. What if any, are the prevailing marks or certification regimes that a consumer might be able to look at?
There aren't any. So there is one organization called the Leather Working Group, which audits tanneries and rates the tannery on its sustainability. But, you know, as I was explaining before, the leather supply chain broadly is so disconnected from one stage to another that has nothing to do with the raw material or anything to do with the agricultural source of the material. And then in terms of finishing, there's nothing that obligates a manufacturer to indicate everything that's been used in the composition of the finished leather material either. So actually, you really can't know anything, in terms of a comprehensive understanding as regards to the composition of the material or its sustainability impact. And I think that we will start seeing this develop, albeit slowly and probably with great difficulty in the leather industry. Because, as you said at the beginning, there's this almost deliberate obscurity as regards to leather as a material. First of all, the fact that I think we do generally tend to dissociate the fact that it was a living animal that was,
like eating meat.
So that's a really, I think, important analogy in terms of the work that we are doing with British Pasture leather, because increasingly most of us have the option to choose, if we want pasture-raised meat, for example, and many of us have the ability to make those choices with respect to our food, to choose around values of animal welfare or ecological impact, and that is not the case with leather material. And then, going further, I think very often there's quite a deceptive quality to the finished material that might lead you to think that it's been processed with other natural materials, and that's also very rarely the case.
Now, you had mentioned when we spoke about some EU regulations,
yes,
which are going to be triggering more sustainability.
So the issue around traceability is very much in the zeitgeist right now, because more and more brands or supply chain actors are being required to have an understanding of the traceability of the materials they're handling or using. The EU legislation that I referred to when we were talking has specifically to do with assurances around deforestation. So it doesn't actually answer any of the sustainability questions that you're probing here in terms of what consumers can know, other than trying to ensure that any material that's handled through the supply chain has not caused deforestation, which is focused mainly on the Amazon.
Okay, but we hope it's going to actually cause a ripple effect.
Well, the obligation will be for traders and brands that are buying the finished material to have that knowledge. And that will begin to drive mechanisms for traceability that could accommodate other information, like what we are doing, which is, to have an understanding of the agricultural practices behind the material. And the reason that we are doing that really is to make the distinction. So I think our discourse around meat and animal products lacks sufficient nuance, in the sense that very often it's a choice between accepting that all meat or all leather is bad because it's associated with factory farming and industrialized agriculture, therefore choose none. And I think too often we overlook the fact that there are livestock systems that are appropriate to regions that grow grass, where ruminant animals can play a very important role in benefiting ecosystems and land and human communities as well. And to be able to, we're starting to do this with food, of course, but to be able in our material supply chains to be able to recognize that distinction, I think that's one of the sort of missions of our project, is to be able to make that distinction, and in doing that, to change our perceptions of the material.
Now, a lot of people would say that maybe we shouldn't be wearing real cow leather, and then we should only be wearing vegan leather. Can you also comment on that and the carbon footprint and the supply chain for those?
Sure.
For that?
So what I've been introduced to as a material that is called vegan leather is usually plastic. So it's typically made from petrochemicals. There are innovations in material production that are very exciting to innovate materials that are leather-like, from mycelium or apple peels or pineapple. There's a little bit of a dirty secret. Again, this is just from my kind of basic familiarity with those materials, which is that Very often, they are still coated in polyurethanes because we have expectations for the performance of this material, that it be water resistant and that it not change very much as we use it. So very often those alternative materials or innovative materials that have leather-like qualities also have a large carbon footprint because of other components that are in there.
Okay. It sounds like a lab-grown meat, real meat. It sounds like there's a vague analogy to be drawn there. Now, how do we design sustainability into products or into our whole mentality? How I want all three of you to comment about the design process and how, and also you can start with design education, like when you were going to design school. And do you think that, there's been a seismic shift? I mean, now there's like huge interest of young design students in sustainability.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been, I do quite a lot of work with education. It's supporting education is one of the pillars of our brand, and I have seen a big shift even from the time that I graduated about 6 years ago now. Specific places like Central St. Martin's, which has a very unique pedagogy, are very interesting because they foster this environment of creative thinking, which can then be applied to many things. In that particular department, it's applied to fashion design, but for example, I think the really interesting thing is if you then started to educate different types of people that are maybe managing fashion businesses or working in the supply chain in a creative way, I think you'd have much more innovation in those spaces. There's an amazing guy called Mitchell Resnick that runs something called Lifelong Kindergarten at MIT in the States, and that's essentially putting a group of postgraduate students in a room and teaching them in the same way that students are taught in kindergarten, and they've created the most amazing innovations because they've just simply been given the space to actually think rather than pass tests. So a lot of it is about how we're teaching. I think we can argue that a lot of creative education in this country is not very creative at all. And so that's a big thing that we need to kind of look at to change. But for me, the like McQueens, if you like, of the future are the people that are redesigning the systems that the clothes sit within, I think, rather than the design of the clothes themselves.
Okay, so how should we redesign the system?
Well, first of all, if you just sell what people actually buy, you've made a massive impact already. If you make it close to the people that are buying it, that makes a massive difference. A lot of it is common sense. So if you don't put plastic into clothes, they're probably going to go back into the ground a lot easier.
Does this mean no more big brands, though?
Not necessarily. I think it's a case of changing the supply chain and like localizing it a bit. And maybe it's a case of like when you buy a Chanel, like used to happen in the past, by the way, is that if you bought a Dior jacket in America, it was actually made in America by a licensee. And I'm not saying that licenses are the right way to go, but it's definitely possible to kind of like relocalize and have a world where your Chanel jacket bought in New York is made in New York, and the Chanel jacket bought in Paris is made in Paris, and having these kind of different ateliers around the world, which then, of course, offers this amazing opportunity for aftercare, for customization, for things to fit you properly. All the things that we all want, all the things that all the global trends are pointing towards, this change in system would allow for. And so I think it's a very compelling business opportunity for people to do things in a different way. And very similarly to food, a lot of fabric comes from the ground originally, and so we've touched on that a lot this weekend. It's something to remember that many materials start on farms. And thinking about that.
Well, Arizona Muse is working on that.
Yes.
Definitely. She's highlighting that part of the supply chain. Now, Dominic, how about localization of manufacturing? I mean, designing jewelry almost sounds like sustainable jewelry almost sounds like an oxymoron. Actually, that's also, it's something that we could say about any of these categories, but tell us about how we could how design students or design education should change, or how your own approaches change, transitioning from your previous phase of career to now.
Yeah, I guess when we set out to design the brand, that was something that I thought of, because the trend that was going on was this kind of demi-fine, this super kind of like low value, low material value, kind of like almost intentionally deceptive to the consumers as to what they were getting, and confusion. And I kind of wanted to take it back to an older sensibility of like a store of value through design, and that kind of like almost the way that Indian wear wear their wealth on their wrists, and that idea of these products lasting longer than you and equating and storing value. In my mind, that's a sustainable way to design. And in terms of the kind of approach and ethos, the reason this brand came into existence is to create skilled workforce for their workforce. In the 1970s, the Royal Mint moved from London to the south of Wales to create work as the mining industry collapsed. So we have been reskilling and retraining their workforce to learn jewellery and to be able to make the jewellery in-house, so that we don't have to go internationally and ship from one side of the world to the other, which is what most brands have to do.
And then I think, isn't it true that historically the British fine jewelry industry used to be quite big?
Yeah,
and now it's like a speck.
It did. We used to be world leading in it, and now it's almost impossible to find manufacturing on any sort of scale. Certainly not enough to sustain actual brands, you know.
Okay. Now, Sarah, you were also, how do we do that in the case of...
Yeah, so, I mean, I think the question is the design process.
Design process and how to embed the sustainability into it.
So with leather material, I think it starts with a real understanding and appreciation, again, of its origins. And so really, I think, look for designers to have the experience, not only to consider what that means in terms of its original impact, but also in the finished material itself, appreciating and learning how to deal with things like growth marks and scratches and changes in grain, and being acquainted with the different parts of the hide and their different qualities. I mean, I think my sense is that very often designers think of leather similar to textile, expecting it to be uniform and standardized, both in its surface quality, but also its shape, and therefore its ability to serve them at the cutting table. This is the moment when I can give a shout out to Alice's book, because this
is on sale outside.
Yes, which is on sale outside. This book by my partner in British Pasture Leather, Alice Robinson, chronicles the story of her creation of collection Bullock 374, which was an entire collection made from a single animal, and goes all the way back to the fields, but also explains much of what we're talking about in terms of the production of the material, as well as her work as a designer, and answers a lot of this particular question in terms of a design process that starts with an appreciation for and an understanding of the material. That's
so it's a nose to tail leather wardrobe, it sounds like. Okay, now on that note, I'm going to open the room to questions. Okay, that gentleman over there, please. Oh, wait for the mic, please.
Hello. So this is for Sarah. It's possible that I just missed something, but there's something I'm not really understanding. So cattle-raised farm and grass-fed, etc. Usually the kind of argument for that is, ethics and being healthier, things like this, because we know that it's not scalable, and you could never feed the entire world that way. So, and what you said about the sourcing the product, as it's a waste product and the cattle aren't slaughtered for that reason, how is it necessarily more sustainable that you know where it came from?
So I'm not taking on the question of feeding the world. I'm speaking from my experience of working in landscapes and food systems where it has been not only appropriate, but in some cases necessary to have the presence of ruminant animals on that land, so grazing cattle. And it is absolutely proven and understood that holistically managed livestock bring tremendous benefit to soil health, biodiversity, ecosystem function, while also producing healthy food for those communities. I can speak from my personal perspective as a meat eater, which is that I eat very little real meat, and I really tend to choose meat and animal products that I know I can support from a perspective of animal welfare and also sustainability, from throughout the supply chain impact there. Also, I would say that, again, just from my personal experience working with farms that put tremendous care and a lot of resource into raising animals well in this way, that I think actually we should value the hide and not think of it as a byproduct, because it is in fact quite a significant part of that animal and what it yields by giving its life for food, and not only that, it's the part of the animal that sticks around the longest. So it is the thing that endures, and much longer than, of course, the food that we can value and enjoy. So I don't tend to think of the hide as a byproduct, and I'm speaking again from the perspective that in many instances, and we're talking about UK agriculture and UK leather production here, grazing animals and ruminant animals, again in holistically managed systems, bring tremendous value and then are important in those landscapes and in those communities.
Okay, this gentleman here.
Can the three of you say something about the technology that is or could be desirable to be used to record information about the components in the supply chain? There seem to be a lot of them, and that information presumably is needed quite badly.
Yes, I think there's a big movement towards traceability generally in the world at the moment in fashion as well. Adding the provenance of a garment always adds to its value. So for designer clothing especially, it's always really helpful to be able to prove kind of through a blockchain traceable system that is in fact a real Chanel jacket or a Patrick McDowell jacket. We've done it in the past as well. I think the hole in the system sometimes is that currently there isn't a governing body around what gets added to those blockchain systems, and so one can add anything to your blockchain system, and then it is, yes, locked into that blockchain, but there isn't anyone governing what goes on it, and so therefore you could add anything. And so that's a little my personal bugbear with that. But the addition of technology in fashion is very important, because traditionally, up until now, garments, apart from knitwear, I think are made completely by hand. Usually, it's still a physical person or many people stitching clothes together. And I think there's been some developments with technology around machines making the clothes. But as far as I understand it, fabrics are so different, and there's so many different types of clothing that we're yet to create a machine that's capable of creating all of them. And so it's a very human business, and so that it doesn't always marry with technology so well.
Okay, there was a young lady there over next to the last person.
Hi, I found that really interesting, finding out about how you've been able to sustainably build all your businesses. I just wanted to ask some of your thoughts about the fast fashion businesses. So these brands that can charge something like £4 for a dress, and you just know that wherever it's come from, it's not been manufactured in a sustainable way. And the issue is that people really like being able to have easy access to these latest fashion trends. So these businesses are doing really well. So they probably don't really want to move towards being more sustainable. But what do you think can be done to try and encourage these businesses to become more sustainable brands?
I mean, personally, I think we have, there's more hope with the consumer and with how we interact with clothing and changing those ways of thinking than there is around trying to convert an ultra-fast fashion business towards sustainable practice. I think, we've seen the rise of those businesses now, so this is where we're kind of in a whole other league of ultra-fast fashion, which is different to fast fashion, which is your likes of Primark, or you could argue Zara. that kind of thing. So it's very difficult to change that kind of business to become sustainable, because if you're selling things on sale for a penny, it's very challenging to then pay someone a fair living wage or ensure that that material is made in a good way. So I think there's a lot of change that can happen around how we interact with our clothing. I was speaking to somebody last night at dinner around, if everybody in this room had bought 4 pieces from their wardrobe that they didn't wear anymore and put them on a rail outside, and then everybody left with 4 pieces, suddenly we've just had hundreds of things recirculate and we've all got something new. We all feel that amazing thing we feel when we find something we love to wear. And there's a big socio-economic conversation here as well. I'm from a very working class part of the north of England, and for many people that's currently what they view as their only way into buying pieces, and it's important that we find a way to bring everybody with us on this journey, and I'm extremely conscious of that, which you could say is ironic because I sell £3,000 coats, but it's very much a conversation that we have to involve everybody in to ensure that we all change for the better. And the most sustainable thing you own is the most sustainable thing in the world is the thing you already own, right? So your own wardrobes often have many things in them that can be altered or changed or dyed or redesigned, and the feeling you get from those is even more special because you did it yourself or you changed it yourself, and you have that emotional connection, which is ultimately why we all buy clothes, because we want to feel something or present in a certain way to the world.
Okay, so you're going to start doing DIY fashion workshops. He's actually wearing a pair of Dickies that he's completely wrapped,
Yes.
like reconstructed, basically.
And there's a lovely story here because these are actually from the costume sale of the English National Opera.
Good. Good. No, there can be great joy in that. Okay, up there, that gentleman, Robin. Okay, I'm going to ask somebody else on the panel.
This is probably a question, again, probably more for Patrick than anybody else, but I'm coming across a number of new brands that are taking recycled plastics or plastics from the ocean and turning them into clothing. And the clothing feels unbelievably unplasticky to someone who knows nothing about fashion or clothing. Could you explain to what extent there is greenwashing or not going on in that process? And, I mean, what is being used? What is being used within the clothing? How is this plastic being reused within the clothing?
So this is a technology which is to harvest ghost fishing nets, which is a very big problem in the world, where in industrial fishing, nets are kind of cast into the ocean and often they're not retrieved. And so the ocean is filled with many millions of tons, I imagine, of these ghost nets. And so these companies kind of go and retrieve them and recycle them into, a new fiber. The biggest one is called Econol, and then they get made into clothes again. This can be done because those nets are made from nylon, and nylon is more recyclable than other types of plastic. And that's another reason why it feels a little bit nicer, because I don't know if anybody has familiarity with nylon garments, but they tend to have a little bit of softer feel to other plastics. And they can be recycled more, which is great. It still is plastic, though, and so, I personally don't really like working with plastic, but we have done it before, especially for more kind of commercially available collections. But I think, because touching on what I said before about fashion being so complex and the fact that there's so many different types of garments and it includes so many different types of materials and uses, is that the ultimate fix is a cocktail of different things. And so it's the solve is actually in all of it. It's about using all of it. There isn't one solution. So I think personally in that situation, it's great that there is no longer a ghost net in the ocean killing marine life, and that it maybe hangs in your wardrobe and you wear it to go swimming or in the rain or whatever.
Okay, over here. Oh, Damien, did you just
Thank
ask
you.
a question?
I was reading the other day that the fashion industry more broadly, and probably not your high-end specialist area, but it's probably one of the biggest consumers of hydrocarbons out of any industry globally in terms of material. And I mean, maybe it's more in the sort of athleisure kind of field, the new materials being produced, but, you know, we all buy and wear this stuff. We're all worried about global warming, but it really very rarely gets talked about. In the same way that, you know, to produce a basic dyed T-shirt, you need 100 liters of water to dye that T-shirt, and then you buy it off Shein for $2. So this is not really a very environmentally friendly or sustainable industry, more broadly. How do you raise public awareness of what people are buying and what is in the materials that they're consuming, and how do we tackle this problem of you know, not just hydrocarbon usage but also natural resources usage in the fashion industry?
I mean, you know, you're doing a great job with the leather and kind of looking into that whole minefield and trying to make it better. I think we can learn a lot from food in this instance. It's very strange to me that we all wear these things on our bodies without knowing what kind of chemicals, what type of plastics, or what type of ingredients went into them and the harm that they might cause. And so fashion needs to adopt, you know, a similar thing to food, where there is an ingredients list essentially on the garment, and you kind of legally have to tell people what's in them, because it's actually quite bad for you to wear some of these things because it's on your skin and it's going into your body. And it's not just athleisure. The virgin polyester is, I think, the widest used ingredient in clothing today, and that's, you know, a really big problem. So yeah, I think if we can go towards ingredient lists, traceability, government legislation, we'll start to see more consumer awareness and hopefully change the mindset of the consumer into wanting to wear things in a different way, just as that mindset has changed around wanting to eat things that do much better for your body.
But do you think, I feel like that is starting to happen in the discourse around fashion, and has the potential for happening quite quickly because we've gotten there with our food, which is, you know, just associating clothing and materials with natural systems, you know, and the fact that the fashion industry is starting, or has more recently been talking about soil health, and, you know, and this idea of, you know, regenerating land and regenerating ecosystems seems to be catching on really quickly. So to the extent that that can be authentic, I think, I mean, I hope there's an answer to that question, which is a part of what you're saying as well, which is, you know, culture and communications.
Right. We need a more multidisciplinary, less siloed approach, which actually underscores the connections between all these different categories of human activity. On that note, we're going to end this panel discussion, and I want to thank these three leaders for their participation. Thank you. Thank you.